May I have your name
Ali Madanipour,
and your affiliation?
Newcastle University, northeast of England.
As we speak, it's only the first day, but I wonder what your thoughts are so far.
Well, I think it's a very interesting collection of people and ideas that people are talking about. A very interesting international range as well. So it looks like a very promising conference.
There's been a discussion about the notion of placemaking and the need to try to define that more concretely. Your own work has been about, as you write, the articulation of the boundary and who controls that boundary. I wonder if you think that could be a way to flesh out this notion of placemaking a little more concretely.
Yeah, well, it's one of those terms that so many people use it in so many different ways, that sometimes it becomes difficult, a bit ambiguous in meaning. And of course, it's one of those things, you cannot avoid it. But I suppose they generally want to say that let's pay attention to a number of things in a place rather than on segregated elements of it. So placemaking becomes a way of bringing different people together and a kind of integrated idea of what makes a part of an urban settlement, of a human settlement. I think that is the kind of integrative element to it. And because of that, the boundaries that divide this place into segmented areas can have a negative impact if those boundaries are harsh or unfriendly. And whether it's between public and private spaces or between different people who are involved in this process.
I'm fascinated by the notion that these different areas with boundaries allow different levels of control between the different areas, and that control expands over time. There are immediate things you can do, like open a door, close a window, but then longer term things you can do by changing the boundary and mutating the space. And I wonder what you're finding in your own research about how that happens and how that contributes to the vitality of a city ultimately.
Well, of course, the boundaries are not fixed. What is fixed normally is, of course, territories, ownership and control and legal ownership of a place. But it doesn't need legal ownership to be translated into very harsh and fixed territories that exclude others. And you see very pleasant cities, those boundaries are articulated in a way that you don't feel necessarily that harsh edge. The harsh edge comes along when there are big divides in society and the society is unequal or different people treat each other with a kind of distance. And the more close people are together, those boundaries are easier to manage. And different territories, different activities, different groups of people, those boundaries, not to say remove those boundaries, because without boundaries life is difficult to manage. We all need to be able to manage. This is a very interesting combination of concealment and exposure. The professor of philosophy, famous philosopher Thomas Nagel, says that we should be able to manage that level of concealment and exposure, and it's an integral part of our sense of well-being. And if we lose that, we feel exposed or we feel contracted. So
in your retreat.
That's right. So the management of that, if we all feel enabled to manage that and feel able to participate or not if we want to, and there are no harsh boundaries that prevent us from participating, that would be a better urban life.
There are some who speak of transitional spaces, semi-private, semi-public, and that those can help to make that transition a little bit easier. Do you see it that way? Do you see that there's it's really about the boundary, or is it about these interzonal spaces that are transitional?
Transitional spaces are the boundaries, and they can be, if they are transitional spaces, they are better than black and white boundaries. So that's the transitional space is a mediating space. So the territories between a public. Of course, there are people who object to this whole notion of separating public and private in that sense. But we see from experience that complete rejection and denial of it is not in the way society is organized. You need that sort of level of control between private territories and public places. But those transition areas are where you manage that.
I've certainly seen examples of unsuccessful projects that have a very abrupt boundary and don't seem to have that kind of transition, and as a result, that people do seem to retreat into the inside, and there isn't much of an interaction between the two. Do you worry? We just had a presentation by Christopher Leinberger talking about private involvement in public spaces, and of course, there's a privatization of public spaces going on around the world in many places. Do you worry about that phenomenon in terms of what it does to control?
Well, I don't worry about private involvement. Of course, private involvement means involvement mobilizing existing energies and resources. But two things. One is the growth in social inequality makes it difficult. And the other is not paying attention to the conditions of possibility of this situation, in the sense that the hidden word in much of the discussions is gentrification. What do we do with gentrification? If we have a situation of big differences between different people, and if you have situations where some people want to come into an area and they have the money, and the whole process is adjusting that area for them and improvement of that area. Of course, you cannot deny the necessity of improvement, and that's very good. The question is that improvement taking place at the expense of throwing some people out? That's the key concern. If that, or ignoring some people. So at one point, the ambition of city development was comprehensive and to say we want to make the city better for everyone. Inclusiveness. And now that inclusiveness only remains at the level of rhetoric. And in practice, you see improvement, but improvement for the better off or the comfortable people.
I guess that's why I worry a little bit about the notion of privatization of public space, because the incentives are potentially different, that the private owners have reasons for managing the space in a certain way and excluding certain people. For example, lower income people are not likely to be their customers for that very reason, because they want to maximize the income of the property, which is very different than a public entity might want to see happen in a space like that.
That's right. And the public entities nowadays, because they have to rely on private sources of funding and management, they are not in a position of strength to make that argument. And in addition, what we have is an internationalization of urban populations, in which our sympathies are no longer with people we don't know. At one point, when they were building up this welfare state system and the support for the weaker people, the idea was that the weaker people are the same as us. Mm-hmm. We build something together for those of us who cannot have access to some things, and we cover them for the period of their vulnerability. Now, the vulnerable people are not us. They are others that we don't identify with. They come from cultures and situations that we find it difficult to understand even. So the tendency of identifying and supporting and wanting to do something, the ability and the desire both dwindle. And because of that, we have situations where some people remain invisible or pushed to one side. If those people are attended to and their needs are met, of course, you can have all sorts of different provisions for all sorts of people, and if that would be a much fairer arrangement.
So does that, in your mind, translate into an outcome of this conference that should be addressed perhaps on the Wednesday discussions? There's a discussion of creating a declaration or a final document of some kind. What would you like to see in that document? And would it be something along those lines?
Well, what I would like to say, can we expose everything about public space to the test of gentrification and displacement, and to the test of whether it's inclusive for all in practice? So a lot of cities have these plans for improvement of public spaces in all places in the cities. So you see on paper, it's very good. But in practice, when it comes to practice, some of those areas get implemented and others are delayed because there's no interest in investment in there. So the test should be, is this something that is leading to displacement and gentrification or not? And I think that needs to be constantly in the back of our minds, because that is a subtext of the process of urban change, because cities are much more significant economically. They are desirable as places to live in by people who work in these new industries. So the idea of selling the city is as an attractive place has found an audience. Now the second question is, okay, what do we do if there are any casualties in this process? And should there be any casualties, or should we be even-handed in a way that these changes are being managed? That is the key question that needs to be answered. But a lot of these places that we see images of are very pleasant places.
Liverpool, you gave the example.
Yes. Yeah. Or the image from various places. I've been to several of these places that I saw very pleasant. I'm not objecting to the quality of those places and to the skills and drive to improve. Of course, it's fabulous. It's wonderful to have that interest and attention. But this is interest and attention to adjust the city for a particular type of person.
And it goes back to your notion of control, right? Yeah. And who is actually participating.
Yeah, that's right. And if we have a situation of inclusive cities, then what are the things that we need to take into account? Like the idea of aging populations. At one point, older people were so much in minority that you really didn't pay any attention to their needs. Because either you didn't have the capacity, there was no pressure, but now there is an aging society. You need to take their interests into account. Or now, I mean, there is in the UK, in recent years, there's been pressure to make all the public places accessible to people on wheelchair. And this is obviously a much welcome development, because it makes places accessible.
Age-friendly cities.
Age-friendly cities, and people with reduced mobility. Because if this is happening, it can happen for all sorts of other vulnerable people. That has to be a point always kept in mind in thinking about cities.
So that might suggest a kind of diagnostic process, or a process that the conference might recommend that cities adopt to evaluate how they're doing on these criteria, something like that?
Yeah, that's right. And not take any nice solutions only at face value. Yeah. Think about what are the conditions that make them possible, and what are the consequences of these solutions on the urban society. And if both are positive, in the sense that the conditions of possibility and the social consequences are both positive and acceptable in a civilized urban society, then that's a very good development. That's a very good contribution.
I'll ask you one other question before I let you go, which is this notion of gentrification and a point that Jane Jacobs, the great urbanist, made, which was that gentrification at lower levels can be beneficial if it increases diversity. The problem, as she argued, was that once it reaches a certain point, it becomes destructive. And I wonder if you see it that way, if you think there's a sort of gentrification at a certain point can be a useful tool, as long as we're aware of the things you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, gentrification, if it's improvement, because I mean, improvement, you see in the history of cities, improvement has always happened. And And that's why we have better cities than perhaps some time ago. These nice places that we go to visit in these medieval cities, at the time they were not really pleasant places, and a modern person would not imagine living in one of those medieval. That's right. Yes. So cities have improved, and in improvement there's always positive and negative things. So we are not talking about blanket rejection of any change up and down the social scale. But the question is the scale of gentrification now, the size of the scale, is a major urban phenomenon. And that therefore invites us to look at this with a critical eye and say, are we missing anything in this process?